Hi everyone, this is the Ignoramus's Guide to Surviving Humanity. I'm Liana Chan here with
Wei
my
Chan.
co-host and
And
our special
Jess,
guest,
hello.
who's an expert
Morning.
on our top. Well,
Uh,
she has more thoughts and more knowledge than we do about our topic today, which is we're going to discuss the COVID-19 hate crimes bill. All the media coverage that I've read or watched on it has been like, this is a very uncontroversial bill because it's
Hmm.
anti-Asian hate. I mean, like prevention of, don't you, well, it's not really prevention, right? But
right.
it says like, it's basically like, are you for anti-Asian hate or against? So really, there should be
Okay, so it's confusion straight away, basically.
nothing.
It's like a triumph of bipartisanship. I mean, it passed through the House like with I think one dissenting or
Hmm.
one no vote, and it just passed the Senate. I think with over 60 Republicans voting against it. But yeah, generally speaking, it does seem very
So
very
we
triumphant.
Republican, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because yeah, in our current universe, right? At least, yeah, if you're not Republican, then you're a liberal. But people forget about the leftists. So
Maybe those 60 Republicans voted against it because they thought it didn't do enough to combat structural racism. You
To
never know.
combat, or not enough to create more structural
Ah,
racism.
right. Yeah.
That's
It didn't go
like
far enough to give police more powers to harass Black and brown people.
I think Biden just
Definitely.
signed it into law, which means it's now the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. So
Okay. And also,
yeah.
did you hear his speech about it? It was basically about how America is better than this, or uniting against hate is what an American trait is.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's interesting how he never mentions the other American traits. And that's one major reason why it's very difficult, like as a leftist, to take Biden very seriously, because every time he speaks on issues of racism, whether it's against Asians or the mistreatment of Black people, his response is always this is un-American and it's unprecedented, or like, we don't really abide by this. This is not something that we subscribe to. And it's like, well, it's literally the institutions that you are part of is what it's built on and is what is currently operating under. So it always just seems very disingenuous to me when he says things like that. Kind of
I
Yeah, it
mean,
sort
disappointing.
of panders to, I guess, that sort of like self-soothing, I don't know, like fairy tale thing that I don't know how many Americans really buy into it.
a lot.
I think liberal America
I
does.
think a lot.
Yeah, I think just judging by let's segue into Biden for a second. Just last year, when the protests were happening, when multiple things were happening, right? Like people wanted something to change on the ground, right? Some people wanted immediate change to see, to prevent Black people from being killed in the street, essentially by police, and violence in general. And there was also the mounting pressure, right, to make sure that Donald Trump doesn't come back into office. And on that second front, it was very much like I felt like there was a very strong liberal message of, vote for Biden and things will change, vote for Biden and Kamala, and, somehow they will just immediately like end
Hmm.
this nightmare that we're living in and, everything will be better. But it's kind of this disconnect, and we can talk about how this disconnect exists right now as well between like the Hate Crimes Act versus, what activists and community leaders actually want. So, Black Lives Matter and the Black liberation movement as a whole, right, are saying we want these things, right? We need to defund the police. We need these other things, and then also addressing the riots or like the violence, well, not violence, the destruction of property that was happening, right, and saying, yeah, we're not advocating for this, but you can understand why people are upset. Rioting is a language of the unheard. All of that stuff. And then his response was just so incongruent, right? It was like at such a different level. It was, I condemn, and more recently as well, he condemned rioting, regardless of what was causing it. He condemned destruction of property. He never once advocated for defunding of the police. So, you know,
In fact,
it was
he's
very,
against that. He's very
yeah, exactly. So it was very, again, disingenuous of liberals to say, if you vote for Biden, then all of these, you know, good things will come to pass, when that was never promised, and it was never what any activist or anyone working on Black liberation actually wanted. So, you know, it just, again, just feels, you know, it doesn't, it feels like what we were anticipating came to fruition, right? You know, nothing majorly has changed. You know, we're still we're still giving money to Israel. We're still bombing the shit out of the Middle East. Like, you know, what really has changed, right? Of course, not having Trump on Twitter and just being in our daily lives is good, but, you know, anti-transgender bills are being passed, and
Mhm.
you know, challenges to Roe versus Wade, which was, you know, the case that gave everyone the right to abortion, that's also now being challenged in the courts.
So most people will say, like, okay, I'm against anti-Asian hate, right? And then that's kind of it. But versus what? So if you're against that, now what? Is kind of the thing. So
the double negative is really confusing me as
it
well.
is confusing.
You're against anti-Asian hate. Wait,
Wait.
so you're pro-Asian hate?
What? Yes. And the other I'm against Asian hate. There you go. See, that's the way you have to do it. But basically, there's been a lot of organizations that have come up in the past year, anti-Asian hate organizations. See, that makes a big difference. Thank you. And so, but what are their goals? You know, what are their tangible goals?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, the ones that I subscribe to, at least, so AAPI Women Lead, that's a great organization, and I think the name kind of speaks for itself, right? They're all about, yeah, actually having like AAPI women like lead the conversation, lead lead the fight, like lead the policy discussions, you know, lead.
But I'm gonna stop you there because, and this is my own hesitation around identity politics, which me and Wei had like a little bit of a conversation about, like how, you know, and we've had conversations about that too. But it's like it's legitimate in many ways, and then it's weaponized in many ways. And the only reason I would stop you there is just because I think the spearheading of this bill were by two, or I think what the main one was,
one
Japanese
Asian American, yeah, from Queens in New York, and one Hawaiian American. Yeah, absolutely. But you know, they live in the democratic machine, right? So
yeah, they do. But I think if you were going to be superficial about it and just be like Asian American voices creating policy, they were Asian American, you know?
Yeah, that's a very fair point. So yeah, that brings us to step two, right? Yeah, step one, make sure that we're listening to Asian voices, especially Asian women. Step two, right? What are they advocating for? And you know, we can say the same about Andrew Yang, right? Very much East Asian, but very much problematic, and not even, not nowhere near the type of politician that we want to be electing or putting in positions of power. So yeah, step two is definitely, you know, what are they advocating for? And yeah, so there's this distinction between, you know, a liberal politician working within the democratic establishment and what they're able to, or what, well, you know, what they, you know, let's not be cynical, right? You know, what do they personally believe and what they can personally achieve in their position versus, you know, people, organizations like AAPI Women Lead, who take a more holistic approach. And a more community-based approach. So there's them, and then there's Red Canary Song as well, who ever since the shootings in Atlanta have been kind of put back into the spotlight in the work that they do in New York City, which is protecting and advancing the rights of sex workers who are, you know, who can be obviously East Asian or other minorities as well. And they really advocated for, you know, the story of Yang Song, who was murdered in like 2018. So so I mostly follow or I mostly look at the work done by folks who are more whose solutions are more, you know, rooted in the community, and solutions who are like which are more anti-carceral, and who take stories and inspirations from people who've been, you know, affected by the system, right, versus people who are perpetuating the systems that are still hurting us. But
Which
then
is what this bill does. I mean, what this act does, I guess, as you said, because it really, I mean, I just read it, skimmed it, because I don't think it's that comprehensive. As bills are not that comprehensive.
Yeah. I mean, it has to get passed, right? That's the thing, isn't it? Like, regardless of what the people, like, you know, believe who are advocating for it, like, it's a bill that has to get passed, and it was approved by a whole bunch of people.
Yeah, Republicans made adjustments to it for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, so you're saying that it will be slightly compromised already.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you're saying?
A lot, I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right. There'll be amendments, etc. But I think the problem with it is its scope is very narrow. So it's basically just about grants. It's really like grants for police, grants for this, right? Like that's basically what
the bill writers, like their purported focus is giving local authorities the kind of the ask that they record you know, these acts as hate crimes, which, you know, in itself, okay. I mean, assault is assault. You know, robbery is robbery. These are already criminalized acts. So adding the hate crime element to it, like, okay, what does that do? Well, it says then that, you know, so it basically, prompts them to record these as hate crimes, which then gets reported at the federal level, which then, you know, the federal government can, you know, do research or, you know, do analysis and then, you know, make policy changes or recommendations, which I don't think they're obliged to do under this bill or this act. But I think that is what they're purporting will happen.
And time on something that is like a circular thing, because it's like you're just going to get more information on the hate crimes.
Which is a good thing.
Hate crimes is already designated as a thing in the US. This isn't adding anything that wasn't already criminalized under law to begin with, right? So
so the only thing that's being added here is the grant or the money put in to a more efficient sort of
So I was reading through it, and I think none of those things are bad. So having multilingual support on a hotline, that's good. Having officers take you seriously when you report a hate crime, that's also good. But again, it's extremely narrow. So what I see is an improvement in the experience of reporting for people and for people reporting those hate crimes, language support, that kind of thing. So I think that's all good stuff, but it's extremely narrow. For example, this is tackling not for example, but what I think is that this is tackling basically the inefficiencies in the police when it comes to recording hate crimes, which is fine. Does it do anything to tackle hate crime? No. Does it do anything to reduce those incidents of hate crimes? No. So that's what I see from this bill.
And also, does it even help the people who have been a victim of violence, right? You know, in looking at non-carceral solutions, in looking at you know, in framing these things like with an abolitionist lens, right? You know, again, it's not about not wanting consequences when bad things happen. It's about, you know, do punishments help either the person that have been harmed, and does it help the perpetrator, you know, not be harmful again, right? And with punishment and with viewing things as crime and punishment, neither of those things happen, right? Like the victim, the person who's been hurt, doesn't feel better, doesn't get to heal, or at least the state does not provide for that healing. And the person who's perpetrated the harm, right, if it's something low level, then if they're put into the carceral system, they're likely to come out being a more violent offender. So, you know, we already have this crime and punishment system, right? And it's already not helping anyone on either side. And then this bill also does not provide that, right? Like a lot of the times, if you actually listen to people who have been hurt, if you actually listen to people who've been victims of, you know, some type of like, you know, random violence or attack in the street, most often they do not necessarily want that person prosecuted. They don't want that person to be punished, right? It doesn't actually make them feel better. What helps them is either like an apology from that person, an acknowledgement, and most than not, like just their stuff back, like their money or like their bag. Once they have their stuff back, they don't really care. So, you know, it's if we're talking about helping and prevention, right? Like we have to look at what is currently being offered and then say, well, if we're just being offered more of that or more efficient way of that, that doesn't actually help, right? Like none of these bills and none of these things actually provide resources for people or their families who've been hurt, right? All of that is done through like GoFundMe, and then you know that
especially like
that old woman had to like donate the money away to be like, no, I don't need this, right? But it's part of like U.S. culture, right? It's everything that should be healthcare that should be provided for by the state is provided by strangers.
Like one of the main issues will be healthcare, like the medical bills that people will accrue from being beaten up. Having to go to the ER can cost $1,000.
And the mental health care that you need afterwards, after being assaulted like randomly in the street or by a random person, like then you're gonna have massive mental health repercussions. And you know, what about the language barriers there? You know, can you get mental health professional help if you don't speak English? So
you both lived for a long time in the US. I've never lived there, but the GoFundMes are wild. Like GoFundMe because someone punched me in the face and broke my jaw. You know, like,
and I don't have the money.
And I don't have the money for medical bills.
Yeah, I'll go bankrupt.
That's crazy.
Or I'll lose my job.
Yeah.
If I lose my job, I'll no health insurance.
I can't believe that's normal over there. That's just
very normalized. Even the founder of GoFundMe, right? The CEO had to be like, whoa, this is not what our platform was intended to be used for, and we're really disappointed in the government for not providing for people because this isn't what it's supposed to be.
Maybe we should have a GoFundMe to lobby the government for healthcare.
I doubt we can make as much as the pharmaceutical companies can. What's the difference between this one and the I guess the Hate Crimes Act of 1960?
Oh, like the earlier one? Yeah, good question. I'm not sure.
I mean, I couldn't really tell either. Like it seemed to be even though it doesn't put a specific number in funding, right? It just seems to be a push towards more funding for the police.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if that's actually the outcome, right? Like that's that's obviously not the narrative that they're pushing. But yeah, I think this one is just somehow more focused on like, I guess, at the anti-Asian hate crimes. But even that, right? Like even now there's been some reporting on the actual incidents and the demographics and the breakdown. And actually, you know, the bill writer herself said that half of the incidents that were recorded in New York City were perpetrated by people who are mentally ill. So, you know, great, we're recording incidents of violence against Asian people, but how can you say that is a hate crime, right? If we can't really speak to the intent of the person who committed the act of violence, whatever it was. It just seems, again, right, if we're talking about prevention, which this bill is said it tackles, right, then if it's 50% of the incidents in New York City, right, then surely a massive way to actually address prevention would be to address mental health. But, you know, that's nowhere on the bill.
But there's nothing about prevention in this bill.
Yeah. There's like one line, so I skimmed it. There is one line, but there's the word crime. I didn't count it, but if you do a quick word search, I mean, the word crime comes up so much in this. There is one line about diverting things to educational programs, and then there's a little line at the end about requiring somebody to go through, kind of anti-racism training or something like that at the end, like at the end of their sentence or something. But it's very like that's 2 lines out of 8 pages, so it's very little. It's a very tokenistic kind of gesture towards the non-crime aspects of this.
Yeah, and more funding towards a resource that already exists, already has one of the highest budgets in the city, in most cities, whether it's LA or New York, right? And their job description is to, I guess, prevent crime, although not really, because they're also not obliged to help anyone, actually, right? There's no law that actually requires police to actually help anyone. That's not part of the job description. So why give more resources to or more money to, you know, a group that already exists and has never helped, and actually usually contributes to more violence, right? Like, especially if you're a vulnerable person, actually, especially if you're marginalized. And, you know, I think a lot of people who fall, even if you make the reporting easier, people who might be worried about the immigration status will not necessarily go to the police, as they shouldn't, actually, because the police are known to work with ICE, and ICE agents have been known to impersonate police, actually. So that's not going to change the way that these communities interact with police.
I was really looking for something specific about this cannot lead to a deportation.
Well, I mean, because when this bill was being discussed, actually, I think in the House,
it wouldn't have got through. Yeah,
you know, Biden signed off the deportation of like thousands of like Vietnamese and Southeast Asian people. So, you know,
yeah, you're not going to call the cops if you're illegal. That's like not going to happen.
So let's like just backtrack a little on some things that might be good about it before going on. Just in terms of you did sort of mention this before, Wei, like why the accumulation of like hate crimes data is helpful. Just why is that a good thing?
For me?
Yes, in general.
Well, I think more information is always a good thing, as long as it's good information. So I think being able to collect data more easily and to be able to report data more easily is fine. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's only going to affect, like, setting up a website, for example, is one of the things in the bill. So I think that's going to be good for, you know, upper middle class Asian people, basically, who are tech savvy. I think having additional language support, pledging additional language support, is also going to be a good thing. Just because, not because that improves anything specifically, but because it is traumatic. If you have undergone a hate crime, if you have experienced a hate crime and then you report to the police, it's double traumatic if they don't believe you, you know. It just makes you feel even worse. So removing that's not a bad thing. Does it do more than, you know, does it do anything to tackle the causes of hate crime? No. But
I mean, I guess my issue with that would be like, I can't imagine the police don't have a multi-language translation thing.
They don't really in New York City.
They don't? I mean, I've worked in volunteer services that
I looked into it, and before this bill or this act, more often than not, even for Spanish language speakers, they would have trouble getting someone in.
Because I just know that like there are like all these services, like when you call in, that you can go to a like translation switchboard, you know, like you can so they must have something simple like that, like, and that's not going to cost.
But this is a federal bill, right? So you lived in LA and Jess lived in New York. This is a federal bill with stipulation requiring each state to do this. So I mean, yeah, sure.
So that's good. Like, great. I think that's good. If that's what, I mean, I just, I do wonder how much money they're going to put in, like increase their funding because of this very little thing, which just makes you wonder, well, where is their budget going anyway? Because like it's billions of dollars in California, and we're talking about billions of dollars for the police department. So they should be able to afford this very little service, but that would be a positive for this act if that is the only thing that comes out of it, which it seems like that is the main thing.
But but to your point, Eliana, as well, right? Like there is a hate crimes act that was passed in the 70s, and so the federal government has already been collecting data on hate crimes, and they haven't done shit with it. So it's hard for me to imagine that this will prompt them into further action, right? Because I think, especially in the way that this act now is being presented, right? You know, around the time that the bill was first passed, you know, as we said in the beginning, all the language and in the media and the language, I think now from Biden and Harris as well is right. Like I think now they're saying, yeah, this is the first step, right? But it's also very much like, yeah, and we've done it, everyone. We've done it. We've done
you've had
something.
this first step many
Yeah.
times. You never get to the second step.
No, they didn't do something.
So that's like what's really annoying.
The thing is that I noticed is that on the first page in the biggest writing, they have mentioned the names of the 8 people who were murdered in Atlanta, Georgia. And then they write out all of the things that they're going to do in this act. And at the end of it, I thought, where are any of these actions relevant to the 8 people who got killed? This would not have. There's nothing that would have gone differently in that specific tragedy that had this act already been in place. Nothing.
Because the rest of it is all about reporting and right. Those people are dead. So
those people are dead. The guy was racist. There was, he's possibly
mentally ill, right?
Yeah.
Granted, they always say that when it's a white person, but he did also seem.
Everyone who murders someone is mentally ill in a way, I guess.
Well,
questionable. People murder people for. The police murder Black people all the time, right? And they're not mentally ill.
Yeah, or in war, I guess. But depends how you want to.
No, I think let's not stigmatize people with mental illness, because the majority of people with mental illness don't do anything harmful against other people. They most often harm themselves, unfortunately. And so we go back to the mental health care.
But in this particular case, what could have prevented that was maybe his access to guns. Like, I think
step one.
Gun rights issue.
Honestly.
Gun rates.
It's really.
Oh yeah, let's not forget that. Gun.
Yeah, I know it's very easy.
We haven't even mentioned that. Yeah.
I think with all these things, right, it's very multifaceted, and if we want to look at actual root cause, right, there's a few things we could probably point to, right? White supremacy, right? The idea that white men, especially, right, and there's like this lone wolf thing, like this idea of things that are owed to them, right, that they're entitled to, and in this case it's women's bodies, and in this case specifically it's Asian women's bodies, right? And then I think he pointed out, right, the kind of frustration that he felt. So there's white supremacy, and then there's also patriarchy, right, like, or white supremacist patriarchy in this case, right, the kind of the feeling that certain men have ownership over women, and then when they're rejected or when they feel like they don't have access to those women's bodies, right, then they use violence. And how do they use violence? In the US, it's very easy to use guns as violence, very quick, efficient. And also there's precedent, right? Like, white men do this type of shit all the time. They get a lot of attention, they get a lot of press, they get to be martyred. And they know that nothing bad's going to happen to them, because when the police approach them, right, it's always very calm, or they can turn themselves in and no incidents happen, right, or they get taken to like Burger King. So
also, there's like a religious extremist thing. At least that was part of the reporting. It was like he was
he did. He said that Asian women would women were tempting him, and he wanted to. No, actually, sorry, that is what he said to the white policeman who took his statement, and then the white policeman then made a public statement saying the suspect has declared that the murder was not racially motivated. Therefore, it was
therefore it's
motivated.
Right. The deranged murderer said he wasn't racist. Let's believe him.
Yeah. You have an interest in restorative justice. Do you think that the act could do more to help maybe the family of the victims?
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Like, if we actually want to, even if we were to take what it says at face value, right? This act is supposed to help address the killing of these women in Atlanta, right? Then it wouldn't just be one bill that we're trying to pass or one act that would become law, right? Because we would have to think about gun control. We would have to think about, how do we dismantle white supremacy? How do we dismantle patriarchy? And that's the thing. The sad thing about this specific incident, or these murders that happened, is that violence against women in any community, right, is ongoing, it's persistent, it's constant. If you look at the statistics, it's horrifying. Women just die at the hands of men, and men that they know and love, at an alarming rate. Like women aren't out there killing other women, or men for that matter. Like men are out there killing each other and also the women that they supposedly love. So this is an ongoing epidemic that never gets addressed by any bill, or not any news coverage. I mean, Central and South American activists do an amazing job of really voicing this and really bringing it to a global stage, with their protests.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't really have a movement that is, there's Me Too, which is more about sexual harassment, in professional spaces, which is a specific aspect of this, right? But generally, violence against women is just not something that anyone really rallies behind, and it just happens. And then when these kind of really popular, not popular, but when these really kind of shocking, I guess, incidents become national, international news, right? That's when we start. But then we also then just start treating it as its own incident, right? this one white person, one white man committed this heinous act against these women, and it's kind of treated kind of self-contained. So yeah, the sad thing for me is always that we don't look at these incidents and then say, there needs to be material change within our societies to actually address this epidemic of violence against women, and it's not seen as such. And so, yeah, if we're talking about how to actually help these women, or to help the families of these women, right, is actually to start treating these things, or to start treating violence against women as not just, individual incidents, right, but as things that, as a society, that we've really failed to address. And that takes a lot of effort, and that actually just takes the recognition by men that this is actually a holistic problem, right, that we need to face. So
almost I feel with these with that particular crime, just having the debate around whether or not it's a hate crime or blah 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 is just kind of distracting, because how does that I just don't see how that makes a difference.
I think for a police officer to just come out first day and to be dismissive, I think for a white police officer to make that dismissive statement, I think is harmful, right? But I think in this specific case, not designating a hate crime, I agree, I don't really care about that. But I think understanding that it was racially and sexually motivated, and making sure that those two elements are underscored, I think that is important, right? Because that does speak to the culture that we have created, and the culture that this person's living in, right? None of these things happen in a vacuum. He didn't
make up hate for Asians and
right, exactly. He didn't he didn't just sit in his basement alone and then develop these feelings, right? It's what he's been exposed to, what we've all been exposed to, and that just comes out in a person like him as something like this, right? And so I think that by dismissing those elements, that is actually harmful, because then we're not addressing you can speak to gun control, and you can say okay, that's an element that would have helped the situation, but it doesn't address the deeper feelings that he had, which were misogynistic and racist.
And so we have another instance of platitudes towards the Asian American community. I mean, most American, really, and no structural change.
And at the same time, right, and Wei and I talk about this a lot, at the same time, you have this continued escalating rhetoric, right, against Chinese people specifically, and against the Chinese government and against China. And so again, this is what makes it really difficult to listen to Biden speak, right? Because he'll say, yeah, hate has no bias, there's no place here in this country. And yet, the aggressive rhetoric against China is uncontrolled, and it's not even and it's not really addressed, right? And it's allowed because for some reason everything they do is bad.
It gets them votes, obviously you should criticize China when they've done something, but don't uncritically parrot CIA talking points or regime change talking points. I think that's completely unnecessary, and you're harming Asian Americans in that way.
I do get a little uncomfortable about conflating the Chinese government with Chinese people in general, Asian Americans in general. But I think that the difference here is that the way that Biden speaks about China, like, we're not going to let them, not on our watch. It's like, it's very much steeped in racism, because you wouldn't really get away with talking about an entire country in this way if, like, your sort of basic understanding of that country is already sort of steeped in the yellow peril. Yeah. Like, you wouldn't be able to, like, so I think that's where it's like different from just criticizing the government, or if they do something,
Yeah, exactly. It's always just the assumption, right? And it's like, they're saying something like that, not on our watch, as if they're always plotting to do something insidious, and therefore we have to be vigilant about them doing that, right? And then again, it's just like this trope of like, Chinese Americans are like double agents, of China, and and they do this, right? They, like, when my dad went to work for the US, they did really extensive background checks, because he works in the oil industry, and that's a national resource. Therefore, you have to check to see if he has any connections with like the CCP, and like definitely doesn't. But it's just like this, this constant othering, and oftentimes I can't tell the difference between someone who's of Chinese or Japanese or Korean origin. So, of course, this suspicion and this hate and this, kind of violent mentality is going to seep into more than just, Chinese heritage people, right? Like, it's going to be across the board. And, a lot of racist people are also not going to be able to discern Southeast Asians even from that either. So, it just translates as this like broad strokes thing. And something like really interesting that I heard about the other day was how, the way that Americans and Western culture consumes, different types of Eastern culture, right? So if it's Korean or Japanese, right, there's kind of that kawaii culture. There's like, K-pop, and it's kind of like this like friendly fetishization that can happen. But there's no like ultimate threat, right? Or there's no underlying threat, because, especially after World War II, the Japanese were able to rebrand themselves, but also, there's not that sentiment here, right? Whereas like China has no like cute like exports that, people can just harmlessly, not that it's harmless, right? But, in comparison, harmlessly consume. And so the attention and the thinking on China, right, is that, it's like this, quote unquote, like sleeping dragon that's going to come and like, take over, and this conflation as well between like how the Russians operate, right, versus like in their foreign policy versus how like the Chinese would actually operate. So yeah, it's just adding to this like sentiment, and there's nothing in like Western culture that takes favorably from the Chinese. So all we're left with is this like suspicion and thinking that they're going to take over, whatever that means. So it's kind of creating this tension as well.
Yeah, they wouldn't even let China have pandas, like China were like, using panda diplomacy to get people to recognize, they were lending these pandas to the zoo. And I remember the Japanese prime minister even like commented that he like doesn't like pandas or something like that. It's so there's so much. I know he's lying. Nobody doesn't like pandas.
He's a liar.
He's racist. And then and also like a couple of articles here and there in English as well, not just in Japan, but just seemed kind of like anti-panda sentiment, but laced with kind of this feeling of anti-China sentiment, really, by proxy.
Oh, we lost Jess for a bit.
Anti-panda hate is real. Jess needed a moment. Jess was just like, I can't do this.
Don't slander the pandas.
Yeah, come for the CCP, but don't come for my people, but do not come for pandas. Yeah.
They're innocent in all of this.
I mean, I would say even the K-pop, like the kawaii culture is not that innocent either. Like, I mean, the fetishization of like Asian women. So, but you're right in that it's not as scary. A K-pop star is not as scary as the CCP or spies. So what do you think actually needs to be done? Like we've talked, I guess like I've been thinking about this for months now, like with all these organizations coming up, and what actually can help? It just seems like all the things that are coming up like are like discussions around stereotypes about, but it just seems like this is across the board. This applies to everybody. Like stereotypes for every ethnic group. Like it's not just Asians. It just seems like all the same lessons over and over, but now we're stamping Asian on it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think what's really interesting is, I personally have seen many like Asian activists last year during Black Lives Matter, and obviously historically as well, right, talk about liberation for all marginalized people, and working on these fronts. And it's been interesting to see these like anti-Asian hate rallies and protests, and things that have come up. And I think, to your point, a lot of them kind of fall into the same traps, or like at least fall into the same hurdles that we've seen in other movements. And the main one being, right, really kind of looking at things on a surface level, and really playing into just like mere identity politics, right? Identity politics in the more modern sense, right? Not when it was first created, right, by the Combat Heat Collective of Black women, who used it to say, like, we need to create a framework to deal with issues that affect us. And the issues that affect us are intersectional, right? It's like race, class, and gender, and other things. Whereas now it's like, oh, let's have someone, say Andrew Yang, who looks like us, represent us, and having that representation will be good enough, or will be good, right? Or like, let's lobby, or let's advocate for this hate crimes bill to be passed. And now that it's become an act, right, we can all like clap and like be happy about that. And then and the problem with that, right, is that like we're not thinking about the consequences that it has for other communities, right? For example, if we're talking about bringing more resources into police or local law enforcement, then we're saying we're fine with funding police to commit more crimes, the people that are actually committing crimes, right, for them to be violent against Black and brown communities. Like, that's what we're saying. We're saying that's okay, even though last year we said that's not okay. I actually just recently learned that in the 70s, Peter Yu was a Chinese man who went to assist this 15-year-old Chinese boy that was being beaten up by the police. And, he went to help and was like, you gotta stop doing that. So the police rewarded him with his own beating and arrest. And actually, Chinatown, the residents of Chinatown protested that. They were out in the streets, and like on the signs of businesses that said we're out protesting police brutality. So I think East Asians have forgotten about, at least I didn't hear this until very recently, have forgotten about our own history with protesting. And again, right, there have been many prominent Asians in the civil rights movement, Asian women actually. So I think we can't forget that this fight for liberation is something that we've all had to contribute to, right? The passing of the Civil Rights Act was the one that essentially had to end, at least legally, like discrimination against Chinese people, like that was done against them. And I think that the reason why civil rights movements have failed in the past, and what we've talked about before, is when we're not looking out for everyone, or when we're saying to uplift ourselves, it's okay to tread on these other people, right? Because then we're talking about like, all right, other people then deserve to be like, because then we get into this like weird territory of, okay, but if we have to fight for our liberation and the treatment that happened to us was undeserved, then we can't make that argument against other people, right? Other immigrants. And I actually see this in immigrant communities, right? Like, and again, historically, this has happened in the US, right? You got your Italics, your Polish, and then your Irish, and then like they all kind of like fight, and then it becomes, well, we're not like those other the new immigrants that are coming in. It happens in the EU as well, right? Like, oh well, we're not like the Romanians or like the Polish. We're different white people, which is another mindfuck on its own. So so I think it's just really worth not forgetting that. And I think it will take longer, right? Obviously, it seems like giving resources to law enforcement and having better reporting techniques is good, maybe in the short term, but right to what we've all been saying is that it doesn't actually address anything systemically, and in fact, it can reinforce these institutions, right, that have been harming not just Black and brown people, but Asian people as well, consistently, actually. So yeah, I think it's just being aware of that and then saying, okay, well, what is actually step 2, right? Like what we talked about. We've seen people out in the streets protesting. It's now no one can claim that they don't understand. The same with, the Black liberation movement, right? Now no one can claim to say that they don't know what Black Lives Matter is. Now no one can claim that they don't know the rise in like anti-Asian like violence or sentiment. So then it's like, what is that step 2? But before we get there, we all have to be real about, what we actually think the causes are and like how to actually address them.
Yeah, and being real about what the causes are. And also, you made a really good point about the police brutality against the Asian community too, because that's completely overlooked. In fact, like, I think one of the things that needs to be dismantled is kind of how the media coverage always uncritically does this thing where it's like they'll show an Asian person that goes, and now I'm worried about my father, or worried about, it's like so specific to, you weren't worried about your father before this. Like, you're only worried now because you saw another Asian man get beat up. It's like so bizarre that there's such a lack of empathy for when other people get beaten up, that you don't think that it could happen to you. And so, like, it's like over and over. It's not just one incident. I've seen that in almost every interview about anti-Asian anti-Asian hate.
Yeah, and individually those feelings are valid, right? Because when you see somebody that looks like your father being targeted and
I don't think they're valid. Like, I think they're understandable. I don't think they're valid, because the truth is your dad could have been targeted before this recent spate. Like,
yeah, I don't know if I feel that way,
still
but
exists.
yeah, I mean, I don't know if I feel that way, but I think like the holding up of individual experiences to and anecdotal experiences to, and then only addressing those things rather than the structural things that create those experiences. I think that is very short-sighted.
Like, only caring about it when it like directly impacts you. That's kind of the
sure.
And it's not that like I'm sure if we talk to any of these people, they do care more than just about themselves. But the thing is, the media narrative makes it so that it's completely acceptable to say these things over and over without understanding, oh, you know what? If it affects our community, it affects everybody. It's like always like just about the individual personal story.
Yeah. And, to your point about the media as well, right, is that they've really tried to push this narrative that it's an issue with like the Black and Asian community, the East Asian community, and this is again historically always been the case, right? Obviously the Rodney King situation and like the riots that came after and the violence that came after, that didn't help. But there's been a lot of effort in the LA communities to repair that and to address that. And as soon as these, anti-Asian incidents were occurring, there were rallies and there were like steps, in those communities to kind of speak out on it. And like I said, right, there's lots of cross-fertilization like within the movements, or just within liberation movements in general. But the media doesn't ever show that, and then so you have these very disappointing comments and this very disappointing viewpoint, right, that when have they done things for us, right? And also, oh well, they're just violent, so they're more violent, so why are we why are we not protecting ourselves, that kind of thing. And yeah, so the media has a huge role to play in that. And then, but in the latest research that I think have come out of all the things, I think the incidents that have been reported on the media, like overwhelmingly, over 95% were perpetrated by white men, and the vast majority of those people identify as Trump supporters. And there are several incidents again, right, with people of color who are mentally ill, and like a really high percentage of that occurring in New York City. So yeah, it's like this is something else that we're fighting against as well, right? It's like this narrative that we're all competing with each other, that, and again, like the model minority myth comes into this as well, right? Like, yeah, like these Asians, these poor Asians, East Asians need to be protected, like they're, you know, they're helpless, and you know, they're victims of
and they
these
deserve
things.
to be protected because they're models.
Exactly. Yeah.
And also by, like, you
right.
would never know that 95% of the perpetrators were white men by the media coverage. And this is
No.
like by the so-called left-leaning media. I include you, Guardian, and like New York Times especially, or yeah, basically like most of them have been actually just quoting each other. So I
Yes.
saw and amplifying any kind of story that is a black or brown person being racist to an Asian person, and I think the kind of common feeling is that most of these perpetrators are black or brown, and they're not. It's crazy.
Yeah, that's definitely the most common narrative, I think. Yeah, because yeah, just like anecdotally, that's been said to me like several times, actually.
There was a I think it was either the Guardian or some kind of like left-leaning publication, and it was about a Black Lives Matter activist, so-called Black Lives Matter activist who got caught doing an anti-Asian hate incident, and then it had, you know how they have the blue links, and I clicked on the blue link, and it went to the original article, and it was from a right-wing publication, and the publication was kind of gleefully saying how he was a Black Lives Matter activist and how he was a staunch supporter of the Democratic Party. But of course, when it went to the left-leaning publication, the Democratic Party part got left out, but the Black Lives Matter part stayed in. So I'm like,
Also, if he's a Black Lives Matter activist and a staunch Democratic,
yeah, exactly,
mess.
So I mean, I'll send you the article. It's just absolute BS, but you know.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, it's just another way to distract us from the real problem, which is like structural racism, white supremacy, and just pitting everybody against each other. So I still don't know what any of the solutions are in terms of what do we do? Like, what do people do about that? Like, it's just like dismantling stereotypes all the time, but it's like sometimes
I think, yeah, I mean, we stick to solutions at the local level, right? So in New York City, right, you know, the mayoral race is upcoming, and you know, there are only a few candidates that are, you know, for defunding of the NYPD, reinvesting in communities, right? And then there's other things that are happening. I think New York City now is or they're trialing for like mental health issues, not sending the police, sending like, you know, special like, or people who are trained instead. In New York City as well, they just, I think, decriminalized, or at least you can't make arrests on solicitations anymore. So, right, so trying to decriminalize to some extent sex work, which again, you know, will help women mostly, who are vulnerable in those situations. And yeah, right, like, you know, let's find local politicians and candidates who will advocate for and who will put funding in, right, after violent incidents happened, right, mental health services, or yeah, looking at aid, right, in terms of like financial aid or help, or yeah, as you were saying, like medical costs. So there's like a lot of practical things that you can do like at a local level, right? And I think if you are East Asian or any kind of Asian, being involved in your communities, and just seeing what they need and like seeing what they want, right? Like a lot of the time, you know, people need like translation services, or like, you know, what I used to do, just get groceries for like old Asian people, right? Like they can't say in English what they need down the phone to like a white person, so use your basic Mandarin or whatever language skills, and help them like on a personal level, and show that like community is still there. But yeah, I think honestly getting involved or at least understanding what changes can happen locally at local politics at that level. I think these changes can ricochet, right? Like, if we take, a few $100,000 from the police, like there and here, to put in these other services, like that can add up to like millions of dollars of money being divested from police, which will in turn, help every community essentially, right? And again, right, also being very, in the US at least, right, being very vigilant about ICE, right? Yes, they're detaining and, mostly targeting, brown communities, but, they also target a lot like Southeast Asian communities as well. And then
people who have spent their whole lives in the US as well are being deported.
Yeah, it's very arbitrary. Yeah, like, you may have committed a crime like 20 years ago. They can just pull you in like one of your standard meetings with your parole officer and be like, all right, you're out, even after you've served time for that kind of thing. So yeah, and then it's like in the US, in New York specifically as well, it's like understanding that the least served communities are actually Chinese communities. Chinese communities, I think, have the most disparate in terms of income levels. So again, right, like understanding that and amplifying that, right, because that again gets lost in this model minority myth, right? Like, oh, all East Asians are productive and rich and financially successful, and that's just not true. In a city like New York, where the poorest ones, some of the poorest schools have, Chinese children. I think what Chicago did recently, or Illinois did recently, was, make sure that teaching, AAPI history in schools, right? That can also be a good like long-term solution as well. So.
Oh, they weren't doing that before?
There's no federal mandate for teaching Asian American or Pacific Islander history at all. So yeah, some states are now starting to look into that as a thing that they might start doing.
Yeah, instead of funding the police even more, why don't you divert money into organizations or projects that elevate Asian American people and help communities and things like that? Also, I get the fact that this bill was so overwhelmingly passed, I think also speaks to the idea that it was just way too weak. Like the fact that so many Republicans voted for it just means that it was utter crap.
I mean, yeah, the fact that they made such a big deal about it being bipartisan.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, oh, they were saying, oh, it's like one of the few bipartisan, which
it
means
shouldn't have been that easy.
Yeah,
it means it didn't do anything.
Yeah, and and I think what we've been saying as well, right, is that there's no point in treating any of this as like specifically, for Asian people specifically, our needs and what we're missing and right, what our prejudices and the way that we're oppressed is not unique necessarily.
No.
It comes.
I mean, it may have unique
but
factor. Yeah, it may have unique details, but the effect is the same thing. And it's just like translation services should be for every department, really, not just only specifically for hate crimes. Like, it's just like this bizarre thing that
translation services in social services maybe.
Yeah, right, and not just for Asian languages, right?
For every language, really.
Yeah, and yeah, I think what's interesting, like if we're talking about like the bipartisanship and like the championing of this or something like that, and a success, we heard very similar comments after the Derek Chauvin trial, right? He was found guilty on all accounts, and Biden and Harris said very much the same thing, right? Like this is a win, this is a triumph, our system is working. Therefore, everyone should just be quiet now.
That does not make sense. How does that show that the system is working?
If it was too bipartisan, it means no concessions were made. Basically, that's why.
Yeah, well, and then it doesn't do anything.
Yeah, exactly.
Ultimately, that's what it is. When Nancy Pelosi came out and said that, like, George Floyd did a sacrifice, it was so disgusting. It was like, no, he was. It's just this idea that he died for a reason. It's like
he died to teach white people about racism.
Yeah, in the police department. Really? No. It was really a disgusting covering for basically the idea that things haven't really fundamentally changed. But yeah. I'm trying to I keep trying to end on a hopeful note, and I just keep getting dragged.
we keep venting. There's nothing wrong with venting. Let's
Yeah. I think attention is good,
Yeah.
right? We're
You don't
talking
have to be
about this, it's
positive.
good.
Mhm.
I'm seeing real efforts in solidarity between
Yes.
communities, between
solidarity is important. That's key, because it's just even if you're just being completely selfish,
Mhm.
you just have more power in numbers. You just really do. So you've got to you've got to get as many allies as you legitimate ones as you possibly can. Really at the end of this podcast, what we learned is racism is bad.
Racism
applies
is
to
bad.
everybody.
Yeah.
Stereotypes applies to everybody.
People of color, please pay attention to each other's struggles and support each other, and don't buy into this performative allyship stuff that keeps going around.
And I mean, I would say that even white people, but everybody is affected by police brutality, including white people. And I think maybe that's also something that needs to be addressed too, so that I can sort of bring in everybody to understand it. Just giving the police departments military weapons and unlimited budgets is just, it doesn't help anybody, essentially.
Yeah. And it's really an extension of essentially how the US and the West operates on a global level, right? Look at their support for Israel, and look at the solidarity and kind of the cross community support for Palestinians, right? Last year, in the movement, there was, we saw Palestinians, were pro Black Lives Matter. We had Palestinian speakers, right, to talk about their issues, and it was never, or should not have been viewed as oh, we're taking away from issues. No, oppression everywhere is injustice, and it's all connected, right?
It is connected.
We're, especially if you're a US citizen, right, your tax dollars go to Israel, and go to the arming and funding of their troops. So yeah, it's all connected, right? The US, the state violence brutality goes well beyond their borders. And again, right, we're seeing also solidarity with Colombia, because again, US imperialism played a hand there as well. And I think this recognition on a global level, right? Because we're talking about solutions again, we can't, it's I think in the short term, focusing on the local level is great, but overall, how do we affect these systems? Well, overall, these systems exist everywhere in the Western, the police are better in Germany, they're better in Canada, but at the end of the day, and they're better in the UK even, right? But when push comes to shove, as we've seen in the UK as well, when you actually challenge those institutions directly, right, the police do become violent. They do make violent arrests. They will, especially if you're anti-police, right? If you're during the Sarah Everard vigils, right, they will directly come for you, regardless if you're a white woman or not. So
and then they will use any excuse to increase their funding.
Exactly. Yeah. To keep their position and to expand their position. So I think really understanding how we're going to fight all of this oppression is it's really understanding that it is real solidarity. It's not oh, if I do this, it'll help me and kind of help you. It's no, it will genuinely help everyone if we genuinely address things at the root, right? If we genuinely liberate our most marginalized from being oppressed and from state violence, then that means we will, by definition, also prevent that from happening to us. So yeah, it's not just something that we do to get the best out for ourselves, right? And it's not a zero-sum game. It's no, it's actually beneficial, has a multiplying impact for everyone. So
yeah. So again, it just comes down to the same basic things that we need to have: healthcare, social net, just better programs or structures that lead to an egalitarian society. It's always the same thing. That would, well, I mean, that probably is my class reductionist coming back out. But yeah, it would help in the long term with all these issues of racism as well. Well, thank you so much for this very long conversation about this anti-Asian hate crime act.
Anti-Asian
Thank
hate.
you. It was
yeah.
fun to rant for sure.
Thank you. Yeah. Did you learn anything, Wei? Do you think?
Oh yeah, so much.
Really? What?
I don't know. What did I learn?
You're like-
What did I learn? That I think I learned that just be very, very suspicious of anything, of things that purport to be anti-racism. Interrogate those sources and make sure they are actually anti-racist.
Right. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Exactly. Which, yeah, that whole thing about just see if it's being weaponized in some way against us, I guess. Yeah. And also the other thing that I learned was that story about the police brutality against the Chinese man. I didn't know about that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which makes a lot of sense. It's inevitable. I'm sure there's so many other instances of police brutality across the board. I mean, it's just like I was saying, it's just the mentality of the police department. Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.